자, 그럼 바로 소개하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘의 기조 강연 평화 경제 세계와 한반도를 위한 전략이라는 주제로 2024년
The keynote speech will be delivered by Professor James Robinson, Nobel Laureate in Economic Science in 2025. The topic is Peace Economy, Strategies for the World and the Korean Peninsula.
My name's James Robinson. I'm a university professor at the University of Chicago, and I'm very delighted to be addressing, albeit remotely, the participants in the 2025 Kim Dae-jung Peace Forum. Let me share my screen. Whoops. Okay, great. I'm going to speak about my research on inclusive economic institutions, inclusive political institutions, and democracy and economic growth, and how it's related to peace economics was the title I was given. And I'm particularly excited to be talking about inclusive political institutions in the Peace Forum because Kim Dae-jung, as everyone knows, was one of the leaders of the democracy movement in South Korea. He faced imprisonment, exile, the death sentence, and he battled for many decades for democracy and inclusion, political and economic inclusion in South Korea. And so, so with that in mind, it's a privilege for me to talk to this audience about my research, which was sort of his life rather than just his research. So let me talk about prosperity, and let me start, if you like, with the Korean economic miracle, which I love talking about and researching. And here's just some patterns of income per capita in the world over the past 70 years or so. You see the United States at the top there, showing solid economic growth in this period since 1950. Of course, there are richer nations in the world, in the Persian Gulf, for example. Income per capita in Qatar, or the United Arab Emirates is much higher. It's also much higher in Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, entrepot economies. But what I want to talk about here, is this staggering kind of economic rise of South Korea. A comparison that I often like to make is with North Korea. Right down at the bottom, you have income per capita in North Korea. That's about $1,000 or $2,000 per year. It's about like the level of a poor country in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas South Korea has now overtaken Japan. It's over $40,000 per year. Depends on, the actual numbers depends on how you correct for price differences and things like that. But, this is an OECD country. South Korea has become an OECD country. It has levels of income per capita about the same level as, members of the European Union like Germany and France. This picture, of course, also shows the rise of China since the 1980s, late 1970s, 1980s. But China is substantially poorer than South Korea, in this data. So let me start talking about this economic success in South Korea, this sort of economic miracle, which has transformed, everybody's lives over a very short period of time, almost a generation, sort of unprecedented in world economic history. And how would an economist think about what causes economic growth? Well, I think since the words of Robert Solow in the 1950s, the economists have sort of converged on this idea that what drives economic growth, such as that spectacular transformation in South Korea, is innovation, basically. It's the creation and adoption of new technologies that raise human productivity. If you think about the Industrial Revolution in my own country, Britain, that took place started in the late 18th century and spread in the early 19th century, that was all about innovation. It was about the invention of the factory system. Adam Smith, remember in Adam Smith's great book, The Wealth of Nations, he talks about the pin factory and how dividing the making of a pin into multiple tasks, the division of labor in a factory, massively increases productivity. Okay, mechanization of cotton, spinning, textile, weaving, manufacture, using machines to spin and weave enormously increase the amount of textiles that people could produce, powered by steam engines, new invention of power. James Watt's a separate condenser enormously increased the productivity of steam engines driving machines. New transportation to get the goods to market, railways, iron ships, etc. Okay, so all new inventions, new ways of improving human productivity. Okay, so in his work in the 1950s, Robert Soler kind of decomposed economic growth, and he showed this is what drives it. Okay, so is this the right way to think about South Korea, the South Korean economic miracle? And I think the evidence is sort of overwhelmingly yes. So if we're talking about innovation, we could think of sort of inputs into innovation, and we can think of outputs. So here's inputs. What is inputs? Well, number of people specialized in innovation. Innovation comes up all over the place. People have new ideas. People who could be doing one job have an idea. So innovations come from many places, but one way of looking at the amount of effort that a society is allocating is to look at people whose specialization is research and development. This is normalized by population, and you see here South Korea rockets up from below the United States in 1996. That's the earliest this data from the UNESCO goes back. It rockets up from something below the United States to a level which is over double the United States. So relative to the population size, South Korea puts more or less more resources into innovating, into research and development than any country in the world. Okay, of course, the United States and China are much bigger. So if I looked at the total number of research and development researchers in China, say, it's going to be bigger. But relative to the size of the population, which gives a reasonable measure of what's the capabilities of the society for concentrating on innovation, South Korea does amazingly well. What's an output of innovation? Well, the way that economists would measure this is through patents. Okay, so when you come up with an idea, a new innovation, what do? You take out a patent to protect your intellectual property rights. I'll come back to patents, but this is a very common way that economists measure how innovative different societies are. And you can see here in South Korea, patenting goes from more or less nothing in the 1980s, I'm going to come back to that too, to enormous levels. Okay, so again, measured in this way, South Korea is one of the most innovative societies in the world relative to its population size, much more innovative than the United States, China, anywhere else. Okay, so here's the output of innovation. Patenting rockets up along with this economic miracle. Okay, I'm an academic, so I tend to think of intellectual innovation also, and that's there in South Korea too. So if I look at academic articles published in scientific and technical journals, South Korea now is up with the United States relative to population. So again, the rise of South Korean science, there's kind of real intellectual life in South Korea as well, rocketing up over this period. Okay, and of course, there's the exports. Right, let me not focus on the exports. Okay, I always like to say, South Korea, sort of amazingly diversified economy also, that's part of this innovation, as I'll discuss. In 1970, 10% of exports, South Korean exports, were human hair for making wigs. The biggest exports were apparel, plywood, so it was a very narrowly based, natural resource based, including Koreans' hair. And now it's this extraordinarily diverse export base, as a consequence of this transformation. Okay, one of the things that's, I think, kind of dramatically interesting also about this Korean transformation is what was the impact of this on inequality? So one of the huge transitions in the world, in the past 40 or 50 years in the United States has been this enormous increase in inequality. South Korea, this is data from the World Bank on income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. You can see it doesn't go back that far, this data. It only covers the period since about 2005. But you see, there's two things to note about income inequality in South Korea. One is the Gini coefficient is extremely low. It's about the level of Germany. So it's far below the United States or, the world's very unequal countries, such as in Latin America. I put Brazil here. I could have put Colombia or many other places. or, indeed South Africa, which is possibly the most unequal country in the world. So South Korea has low levels of income inequality compared to those places. Not just is it low, but it's very persistent. You see, over this period here, over the past, 20 years, there's very, very little change in the level of income inequality. I can measure this in different ways. So a data series that goes back further in South Korea, back to 1980, is looking at the share of different groups in national income. So, for example, I could take the richest 10% of South Koreans and ask, what share of national income accrues to those 10% richest people? So that's a common measure of looking at inequality. The greater the share of national income that accrues, to the rich, the more unequal the society is. So again, if I look at this picture, I see, South Korea today, it's about 35% of national income accrues to the richest 10% of people. That's lower than China. It's lower than the United States, which is about 45. You can see Brazil, it's about 60, and South Africa, it might be 65% of national income goes to the 10% of people. So again, South Korea is both relatively equal comparatively, and there's not that much change in this. Maybe it's gone from 32, 33% to 35, 36% in this period of over this 45-year period. There's been this dramatic economic transformation, and this doesn't look like an enormous increase in inequality, certainly not the type of increase in inequality that you've seen in China or in the United States over this period. So South Korea's undergone this economic miracle with really muted increases in inequality, and that's quite an achievement. Okay, so why has this happened? Why did South Korea become such an innovative and economically dynamic society with relatively low levels of inequality? And I think the answer to that is it's built inclusive economic institutions. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, by institutions, by economic institutions, I just mean the rules that govern incentives and opportunities in the economic sphere. So let me give you a very specific example of an economic institution which I'm going to claim has this particular property of being inclusive. And let me go back to patents, since I mentioned patents, and a specific patent, which is Thomas Edison's patent for the light bulb. Okay, 1880, Edison patented the light bulb. Okay, so what is a patent? Well, a patent is an economic institution. It's a rule that protects your intellectual property rights. When you innovate, you create wealth for yourself. But ideas are very easy to copy. Other people can look at your invention and sort of start copying it, and they create wealth for themselves. So any innovator creates far more wealth than they themselves benefit from. So the idea of a patent is, by protecting your intellectual property rights, you bring individual people's incentives closer to what the social incentives are. Okay, so it's an economic institution that creates incentives. And what's fascinating about the patent system here in the United States, for example, in this period, is it was inclusive in the sense that it was kind of based on what you might call a level playing field. Okay, meaning what? Meaning everybody could file to have their idea protected with a patent. Everyone paid the same fee, and the state enforced your intellectual property rights. So Edison, for example, why is this so important? Edison, who was he? His father was a roofing contractor. He was homeschooled. He was just a person with enormous energy, enormous creativity. He had over 1,000 patents in his name at some point. Okay, so what does that mean? We're thinking sociologically. Where does innovation come from? It comes from people. It comes from people's creativity, their ideas, their projects, their passions. Those people are spread everywhere in society. You don't know where they are. The government doesn't know where they are. So you need to create inclusive institutions in the sense of creating very broad-based incentives and opportunities that allow all of that latent talent to get to the top, that allow them to file patents to protect their ideas, that allow them to get loans from a bank to start a business, that protect their property rights, the rule of law, that means they can use courts to protect their property rights and develop their business and their ideas. So inclusion, broad-based incentives and opportunities. You need that to tap into all the latent talent in your society. And I think the patent is a kind of great example of an inclusive economic institutions that did exactly that in this critical sphere of innovation. Okay. And I think, going back to the Korean case, inclusive institutions don't just give you cars and telephones and all the things that you might think of. For me, the cultural aspect of these things is incredibly important also. Korea is not just an economic phenomenon. I mean, it is, but it's also a cultural phenomenon. And those two things are interrelated, of course. They're interrelated in the United States. Think of Westerns and Hollywoods and Coca-Cola and blue jeans. And, like the whole culture is related to the economic success and expansion of the United States. It's true with Korea also. Innovation expresses itself in many different domains, and that's exactly what you see in Korea, whether it be K-beauty, K-dramas, K-pop, and of course, closer to the theme of today, K-democracy. Okay, so inclusive economic institutions are critical. In our book, Why Nations Fail, Professor Asamoglu and I contrast that to the opposite, which you could call extractive economic institutions. What's an example of extractive economic institutions? Well, one of the reasons I like the Korean Peninsula so much is that you have both inclusive and extractive. North Korea exactly has extractive economic institutions. It has economic institutions that do not create broad-based incentives and opportunities. They're economic institutions which create incentives and opportunities for people connected to the ruling party and the ruling clique, but most North Koreans are completely excluded from incentives and opportunities. Okay, that creates poverty. Inclusive economic institutions creates innovation and prosperity. Okay, but where do they come from? Why does, for example, South Korea have more inclusive economic institutions than North Korea? Well, that's obvious also. It's the outcome of a political process. Okay, so we say, and this is where democracy comes, we say that inclusive economic institutions emerge when society creates inclusive political institutions. It's the politics that creates the institutions. There's two dimensions to inclusive political institutions. One is a broad-based distribution of political power. In the modern world, you can think of democracy. We don't use democracy too much in our original work because, we're trying to talk about a lot of historical examples, and you could say talking about democracy is a bit anachronistic historically. So we emphasize a broad-based distribution of political power. And the other dimension is what we call a state with capacity. So you have to have sufficiently strong state institutions to enforce the patent law, for example. I emphasize that, when you pass a patent law, your intellectual property rights are protected, but that's only effective if the state can actually enforce that. Okay, so you need a state with sufficient capacity or power to kind of regulate society and enforce things like the patent law. But the distribution of political power is crucial because in whose interests is such a state going to operate? Okay, that's the crucial question. If you want the state to operate in the collective interest, then it has to be accountable to the collectivity, and political power has to be broad-based for that to happen. Okay, so it's true in some circumstances, and I'll come back to this when I talk about China in a bit, you can have growth under what we call extractive institutions, but that growth tends to be transitory. In some sense, that's what Korea had in the 1970s and 1980s. But the fact of the matter is that the real upsurge of innovation in Korea, which I showed you earlier in the patenting data, comes after the transition to democracy and really inclusive institutions. Okay, so this is just an index of electoral democracy showing this enormous transition to democracy, starting in the late 1980s, but really consolidated, when Kim Dae-jung finally comes to power in the late 1990s, in 1998, and you can see how in this period South Korea transitions from being less democratic than the world average to much more democratic than the world average, or even the Asian average. And what I've shown in my research, is that democratization, the transition to democracy, is associated with significantly greater income per capita. So this is just a picture. I don't know how nerdy this is, but if 0 is, we look in the post-Second World War period at countries that democratize. And we also look at countries that kind of transition away from democracy. But this is a figure of, imagine I looked at all countries that transition to democracy. So they do that at different dates. But I kind of normalize everything that it's sort of 0. So I'm taking all these different countries that democratize at different dates. Could be Argentina in 1982, could be the Philippines in a different date, could be South Korea, and I say, okay, let's call date 0 the date when all of those countries democratize. And what you see is after democratization happens, then there's a significant increase in income per capita, okay, of indices of development, okay. I could look at this as an even more nerdy way in the Korean case, and just sort of zoom in on the Korean case and just plot in some sense the data. Okay, so all of these like light blue dots are just data points for all the different countries in the world that we have data for, and I'm just pulling out of that picture the Korean data. Okay, and if you look at this Korean data, the red circles are all dates before democratization, and the green circles are dates after democratization. And you can see that this cloud of points on the right, which are observations after Korea democratizes, is kind of significantly higher than the group of observations on the left. Okay, so there's variation here. So some places you get 1983 or 1987, you have pretty rapid rates of economic growth. But when you look at these two clouds, you can see actually the cloud to the right, which is South Korea after democratization, is kind of systematically shifted up relative to the cloud to the left. Okay, and what's that telling you, and that's what this kind of this relationship, this upward sloping curve is telling you, is that South Korea grew faster economically after democratization. That's what that shows you. And that's what our results kind of robustly illustrate. Okay, there's lots of fruits of inclusion. I talked about K-pop and K-beauty, but here's one of my favorite examples from Kim Dae-jung's term as president. It seems to be it seems to be not clear. Some people suggest that he actually initiated this. I couldn't quite get to the bottom of that, but it certainly happened as he came to power, as he assumed the presidency, which is Korea had a financial crisis and they had an IMF problem. How did they solve that problem? Koreans brought their gold forward. Okay, so they contributed their gold to pay off this IMF problem. Okay, so I think that's a kind of remarkable achievement. I can't imagine that working in Britain or the United States, honestly. And it tells you something about, I think, about the extent to which Koreans really identify, with their society, and at the time of democratization, really identified with this inclusive society that was being built, and they wanted to contribute to it. So that's something really fascinating. Okay, so here's the sort of theory in a nutshell, you could say. I emphasized in North Korea, they had what I called extractive economic institutions that creates poverty. And the reason they have extractive economic institutions is because they have extractive political institutions. South Korea made this transition to inclusive economic institutions as a consequence of political inclusion, and it became a prosperous OECD country. Okay, and this diagram, it's very kind of simplistic, but it actually allows you to talk a lot about the dynamics of different societies and how, becoming prosperous entails moving from extractive economic and extractive political institutions towards inclusive and extractive economic institutions. And in our book, Why Nations Fail, the kind of forcing variable, if you like, in that transition is really politics. Think about the life of Kim Dae-jung. What did he do? How did he spend his life? He spent his life struggling for democracy, for trying to force the dictatorship to open the system politically, to allow people participation, representation. So that's the big story. That's the big story about the emergence, of democracy in Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union, of Poland in Eastern Europe. It's the story of British democracy. So I think, that's the emphasis on this political force driving economic change, and on on people in society organizing as they did in South Korea to force change, to force political inclusion, which then deepens economic inclusion and economic growth. But let me just, here I could talk about many things, but time is limited. So let me talk about this China. Okay, how does China fit into this picture? So you can see this arrow here. It's sort of suggesting what? It's suggesting China went from having extractive economic institutions in the 1970s towards having much more inclusive economic institutions. That's what started Chinese economic growth during Deng Xiaoping's period of power. He started basically, he started demolishing the socialist economy, allowing people incentives, allowing people opportunities, allowing people to make their own decisions, to be the residual claimants on those decisions, creating incentives. And that generated very rapid rates of economic growth. Okay, so this is another example of extractive growth. I characterized economic growth under President Park in South Korea as extractive economic growth. And in some sense, the best example of this is the Soviet Union. Okay, so when I was a student in the London School of Economics in the early 1980s, we were still being taught that if you wanted to have rapid economic growth, what you needed was something like central planning, whatever they'd achieved in the Soviet Union. And in fact, that's what many people thought. Here's Paul Samuelson, possibly the greatest economist of the last century. His forecast from his textbook of the Soviet Union catching up with the United States. So in the 1961 edition of his textbook, the Soviet Union catches up with the United States in the year 2000. Okay, I go through to the 67 version. Yeah, the picture's basically the same. I go through to the 1970 version. Maybe things weren't looking quite so good. Delayed for 10 years. If I keep going at the different updated editions, the catch-up gets delayed, and then eventually the figure disappears from his book. Okay. Now, if you tell students that the Soviet Union was going to overtake the United States, they're sort of baffled. Okay, but if you go back you go back to those days, the 1960s, for example. The Soviet Union did extremely well in very narrow domains of technology, in rockets. They put the first man in space. They fooled the CIA. They fooled every economist. They fooled their own leadership. Khrushchev said, "We will bury you," into thinking they had an economic model that worked. And in fact, it did look like it worked for about 50 years, from the first 5-year plan in the 1920s right the way through until the late 1970s. It looked like it was going to work. I know there's many differences between the Chinese experience and the Soviet, but I think this experience is very useful to show how fooled we can be, by some period of what we call extractive growth, into thinking we can just kind of extrapolate this into the infinite future, and without thinking about its political and institutional underpinnings. Okay, so why was growth in the Soviet Union transitory? Why do we argue in our work that economic growth in China is going to be transitory too? And I think my view of this is pretty simple. And I think this is a view that world history teaches, is that you can't have you need inclusive economic institutions to prosper, but you can't have inclusive economic institutions at the whim of narrow elites. Okay. And this is very well summed up by a famous, oft-quoted remark from Lord Acton: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what you have in China now. You have basically a personalized dictatorship of President Xi. He's going to be in power forever, and I think you only have to look at the history of China to see how that's going to end, and it's not going to be good for the economy. Now, when you talk about China, people say, "Oh, this time this is different. This time it's different." Okay, and it might be. I think that's actually a serious discussion. This is a very different cultural context. it's not a Western context, it's a Confucian context. You know, there's the cultural context is very different. And maybe Lord Acton's adage doesn't apply. Maybe power doesn't tend to corrupt in China. I think it's kind of worth discussing. So, for instance, you know, a very common cultural argument about why China was different would be to say, okay, the difference in China is there's this culture of respecting merit. Confucius says in the Analects, promote those who are worthy and talented. And if you think about it, this is a remarkable distinction between China and the Western world. You know, not just China, but Korea also, you know, had a pre-modern elite that was chosen through a competitive examination system. Okay, could be. But then I think of this picture, you know, Jack Ma. You know, Jack Ma in some sense was kind of emblematic of the first wave of entrepreneurship and innovation, you know, in the 1980s as the Chinese economy took off. What happened to Jack Ma? He made a pretty mild criticism of government regulation, and he disappeared. He disappeared in almost Stalin-esque fashion. Okay, and I guess my claim is you cannot have an inclusive economy when you can just disappear like that for criticizing the government. Okay, so all right, so that's the connection between institutions and prosperity. Inclusive economic institutions generate innovation and prosperity, but to have inclusive economic institutions, you need to be inclusive politically. You may value political inclusion and democracy for lots of other reasons. Okay, I'm not saying the connection to economic growth is the only reason. No, you think that democracy is intrinsically valuable as a way of making decisions, and you know, so I'm not that. Absolutely, I'm an economist, so I'm talking about the economic consequences, and I think they're profound and undisputable. But you know, we could talk about many other aspects of democracy, and in this context, I think, you know, there's a fascinating and powerful connection to peace. You know, we're interested not just in, you know, the consequences of political institutions in South Korea for the welfare of Korean institutions, or, you know, anywhere else in the world, but we live in the planet with billions of other humans. What are their global implications? And I think, you know, the big fact in social science, you know, which you have to bear in mind here, is what's called the notion of the democratic peace. Okay, so democracy doesn't just improve living standards and welfare, you know, for its domestic citizens. It also enormously reduces the propensity of countries to go to war. So it's a fact that democracies hardly ever fight each other in warfare. Okay, so I think there's lots of reasons why that is. You know, it could be that warfare is started, you know, for personal reasons by unaccountable leaders, and once you have democracy, then citizens who are actually going to have to fight, for example, they can influence policy much more. Okay, so that reduces the propensity of a democracy to fight. But one kind of fact, you know, that we found, for example, to go back to my work on democratization, is, you know, I showed you, you know, the transition to higher levels of income per capita around like this year zero, you know, where we kind of normalized countries' democratizations. But in that paper, we also look at other things that go on, you know, and, you know, part of those are economic outcomes such as school enrollment. So we find that democratization is robustly associated with, you know, higher levels of educational attainment, higher school enrollment, lower levels of child mortality. But let me point out here something which is not the focus of the paper. We also find it robustly associated with lower levels of conflict, okay? Lower levels of riots and violent events. So society tends to be less conflict prone as a consequence of political inclusion. Perhaps that's intuitive, but we also find less incidents of warfare. So countries tend to be less involved in external conflicts as a result of democratization. So really, you know, this is just kind of echoing this notion of a democratic peace that I was talking about. I think, you know, there's lots of different mechanisms going on here. You know, I mentioned the fact that a country where the leaders are subject to democratic accountability may be just much less likely to start wars because citizens are going to suffer and citizens control those decisions. One set of facts which political scientists have studied a lot in the international relations field is the fact that democracies are actually much better at winning wars. Okay, so in this on the horizontal axis here, this is a particular index of democracy called the polity score, which goes from -10, which is the least democratic, to +10, which is the most democratic. And this is just plotting the probability of winning a war. So in the figure 2 here on the left, I should have probably put figure 1 on the left and figure 2 on the right, but I wanted to talk first about initiator states. So that means what's the probability of winning a war for a state that starts it as a functionist democracy? And what this says here is the more democratic a country is when it starts a war, for whatever reason, the more likely it is to win the war. Okay, I did say democracies hardly ever fight other democracies, but they do fight non-democracies. Okay, so this is mostly that variation here. Okay, it's mostly about, so this is a sort of, this is not, when I talked about democracy in the research we did, we looked at 0-1 kind of democracy or autocracy. This is a more subtle scale. This goes from -10 to +10, so it allows countries to be more or less democratic. Okay, so there's more variation here, but whatever, so the fact here is that if a democracy initiates a war, the more democratic it is, the more likely it is to win the war. And the right-hand figure says, instead of looking at the country that initiates the war, let's look at the country that's kind of attacked, if you like. And what this says is, again, the more, they call it the target state, the more democratic that target state is, the more likely they are to win the conflict. Okay, so whatever way you look at it, democracies are more likely to win wars. Why is that? Well, because they get just much more buy-in from the citizens. Citizens are much more willing to participate in conflict because the state is accountable to them. Okay, and they're much more able to act collectively. So of course, this is a reason why you don't want to fight a democracy, because democracies are very good at fighting and winning wars, much better than autocracies. And this is just kind of part. And it's not the only mechanism, as I said, but there's a mechanism. It's one of the mechanisms on which there's better data. Okay, so democracy is not just about what happens internally, but it also has this peace, these consequences for peace much more broadly. Okay, so let me kind of end by talking a little bit about South Korea and democracy today, since many people are anxious about democracy in South Korea. After all, you had an attempt to create martial law very recently. And of course, you could say that's only one example of what my colleagues in political science here call democratic backsliding. Okay, of course, South Korea is surrounded by undemocratic regimes in China and North Korea and Russia, so it's very close to non-democratic regimes. And democracy everywhere seems to be challenged. Why is that? So when I think about that, I go back to a fact that my former colleague, Samuel Huntington, pointed out 35 years ago, that democracy sort of comes in waves. If I go back, he started by looking at the 19th century. If you think about my own country, Britain, for example, Britain democratized in the 19th century, starting with the first Reform Act in 1832, and then there were subsequent Reform Acts in the 1860s and the 1880s, and finally, universal male suffrage and then female suffrage comes about in 1919 and 1928. And most parts of Western Europe, Germany, Belgium, Scandinavian, were sort of democratizing over this period also. Okay, and quite a few Latin American countries. But then there's what he called a reverse wave. So countries move in waves, and then there's a reverse wave in the 1930s. Democracy collapsed, all over, in Argentina, in Latin America. It collapsed, in Germany and Western Europe. So there was a reverse wave. After the Second World War, there was another wave of democratization. Okay, then there was a reverse wave. Democracy fell to coups, all over Latin America, for example, Africa after independence. And then in the 1990s, there was another wave. So that's what he called the third wave, That started, who's part of the third wave? South Korea is part of the third wave. The Philippines, all over Latin America, all over sub-Saharan Africa, this third wave kind of got traction. Okay, so what does Huntington says? Well, basically we're experiencing another reverse wave. So Sam Huntington passed away, unfortunately, but I think if he'd been around, he'd have said, okay, it's about the time for another reverse wave. Okay, so we're experiencing a reverse wave. Now, in Huntington's work, it's not exactly clear what drives this. Why is it that democracy is now threatened? There's this, this kind of reverse wave happening. Why is democracy being challenged in South Korea after it's been so incredibly successful at improving South Koreans' living standards, as I showed you? So the data is sort of overwhelming. Why is it being challenged? Well, I think there's many reasons for that. Some of them might be idiosyncratic, but I think some of them are kind of systematic. I think in Sam's work, it wasn't so clear what the mechanism was. But I think, one of the ways to think about that is that, when you democratize, when these waves happen, and I know this because I experienced, quite a bit of this wave in my work in Latin America or in sub-Saharan Africa, then democracy promises so much. Democracy promises to transform people's lives, and it does. It does help. It does do good things. I showed you, but relative to your expectations, that's the challenge. Expectations are so high that maybe democracy is bound to be disappointing. And then people look at alternatives. They try to evaluate alternatives. They try to, and why would that be correlated over time? Well, these waves are correlated. The democratizations are correlated. The disappointments are correlated in some sense. So I think, that's the way I think about the world we're in at the moment, is we're experiencing a reverse wave, which is challenging democracy all over the place. I guess the good news is we've experienced them before and we've exited from them, and we've had a subsequent fourth wave of democracy. So perhaps, but that's not very well in South Korea, and Kim Dae-jung would certainly have known. There's no argument for complacency there. These things happen because people make them happen, and people fight to make them happen, as he did his whole life. So it's not a deterministic prediction. It's something that people have to make happen through their own collective action, in the same way I described these transitions from extractive to inclusive institutions. So we're in a world where democracy is kind of being challenged, and I think for someone like me, the key thing is, and for someone like the Kim Dae-jung, I guess, Foundation, is to emphasize like all the benefits that flow from democracy. Yeah, I mean, the other side of the street is always greener, but the democracy has created enormous improvements in economic outcomes for people, and it's also enormously facilitated a kind of world peace, as I say. We've been living since the Second World War through one of the most peaceful periods in world history, and one of the reasons for that is because democracy is spread, and that has spread peace with it. Okay, and one thing, next time I'm in Seoul, you can explain this to me, because I find it really hard to understand. I know that in South Korea, there's a lot of agonizing about the current situation, and there's a lot of kind of sort of disquiet about where the society is, and what brought this attempt to create martial law on the country. And I think maybe that has lots of good features in terms of just kind of getting people to assess the challenges and the problems and make priorities and figure out how to move forward and keep this remarkable experience that South Korea has had on the road, kind of reboot it in the same way I think that Kim Dae-jung himself rebooted it, after the transition to democracy, after the Asian financial crisis. There was a rebooting, and, Korea came out of that dynamic and even stronger. So I thought I'd end, on a high point. And my attention was just drawn the other day to the 2025 Happy City Index, and Plato is quoted as saying, this city is what it is because our citizens are what they are, and that's the story in Korea. Think about my gold example. Think about what created political inclusion in Korea. That's the people. That's the determination of the people to fight for an open and inclusive society. That's what they created. Now, according to this index, you may or may not believe it, Seoul is the 6th happiest city in the world after Antwerp, Aarhus, Singapore, Zurich, and Copenhagen. It's always Copenhagen on the top of all these things. But Seoul is up there, and I must say, as an outsider, I find Seoul so kind of fascinating, so open, so dynamic, so creative, so interesting. It's always such a pleasure for me to be in South Korea. And I guess, there's somebody's optimistic in Seoul here. So I'd just like to end, by again, thanking the organizers for generously inviting me to address this very exciting forum, and just to emphasize how important, the work of organizations like the Kim Dae-jung Foundation is in reminding Koreans and citizens of the world of how important democracy is for the prosperity of their societies and for spreading peace and sustaining peace in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 고맙습니다. 뜻깊은 기조
Thank
강연
you.
함께 하셨습니다. 제임스 로빈슨 교수님께 다시 한번 감사의
Another
말씀드립니다.
appreciations to the Japanese James Robinson. He talked about the complex crisis and encouraged us to find solution through the crisis. We may find answers in the spirit of Kim Dae-jung's life.
자, 여러분 이 시간을 저희가 마무리하기 전에
Now, before closing,
함께 준비해 주시고 또 교수님과 소통해 오신 백학순 위원장님께
I would like to invite Chairperson Baek Hak-sun to the stage and on how he prepared this event.
제가 로빈슨 교수님 강의를 앉아서 들으면서
As I listened to Professor Robinson's lecture,
로빈슨 교수님의 마음을 또
I
감사의 마음을 어떻게 전해드릴 수 있나 하는
I really wanted to deliver our appreciation to Professor Robinson. So I asked our MC to find this moment for me to deliver my appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, Korea is the icon of revolution and innovation, so we enjoy a lot of benefits from this economically and socially. And through one's life, there was one person who made the greatest contribution to this life. It was Kim Dae-jung. And Professor Robinson really well captured the process that the country, the Korea, walked through along with President Kim Dae-jung. Professor Robinson wanted to be with you at this moment. However, he has to lead the classes in the university because it is the middle of semester. So he provided pre-recorded video for us. And in doing so, he expressed how much he respects President Kim Dae-jung. And it is not just the emotional expression. As a scholar, he put together all the facts to explain Korea's economic and political success. So to him, he asked to give him more information and data. So I recommended him to read Kim Dae-jung's autobiography.
번으로 되어 있잖아요.
Now, in Korea, in the Korean publishing market, the autobiography is the two
800페이지 정도
books.
되는
It was a very thick
작품이었고,
book,
Conscious in Action,
two books.
행동하는 양심이라는
The title is Conscience in Action. It's one book is 800 pages of book. So I recommended him to read his autobiography and the Conscience in Action. And he borrowed the book from the library of the Chicago University. Can you imagine that the Nobel Economics Laureate would get a lot of requests for the paper presentation and the speech delivery? He devoted a lot of time and energy to put together this presentation. So I really wanted to deliver our appreciation to Dr. Professor Robinson.
고맙습니다.
Thank you.
이렇게 품격 있는 기조 강연이
This was
준비되기까지의
a very
과정, 의미를
elegant
더
and
깊게
graceful
이해할 수 있었습니다.
a moment that we can imagine how well this opening ceremony was prepared with all the people. This is the end of the opening ceremony. Thank you for being with us until this very end moment. And this is not the end actually. Tonight at the Mokpo Hadang Peace Square, the peace concert will be held with a lot of people. The musicians, artists such as Coyote and An Sung-hoon, who are from this Jeollanam-do province, will welcome a lot of guests there. And on the second and third days, when discussions on peace begin in earnest, the program will feature special lecture, 4 sessions, and 2 peace roundtable. And we invited Professor Kim Jong-ho of KAIST, known as the father of semiconductor, will deliver a special lecture on the theme of effective development of AI and promotion of peace. And this year, discussions among experts on peace of the world are prepared in 4 sessions, and in addition, bringing together experts from conflict zones around the world to share realities on the ground and seek a vision for coexistence and peace. A peace roundtable and the youth roundtable are also prepared, which wait for your active participation. With that, I would like to conclude today's program. See you again. Thank you.